If you would open your Bibles to Mark chapter 11. Mark chapter 11. We've been studying the account of the gospel of Jesus, the history as it relates to Jesus, and we've been examining it, and we move from different aspects of the different gospel messages from time to time, but we've been examining it from the view of Mark, the disciple of Jesus, as he's recording for us the various aspects of the life of Jesus and giving us this record. He's the more concise, maybe in some ways, than the others who record the life of Jesus, and so we don't always have the same level of detail when it comes to what Mark writes as we might have with others, but we've been studying his record again of the life of Jesus. We've been off for a week and a half with the VBS in the middle of everything, so it's been a week and a half since we've had a discussion about this. Way back on that Wednesday, 2 Wednesdays ago, I guess, we opened up a discussion about Mark chapter 11. At the beginning of the chapter, basically what happens? What are we beginning the process of? The last what? The last week, right? We're in that last week of the life of Jesus. And at the beginning of chapter 11, we begin the process on Sunday to begin to go through all those days that lead up ultimately to the crucifixion of Jesus that will occur at the end of this week. Now, they're in the basic region of Jerusalem, but they're not staying there. They kind of come in and out of the city over a period of several days, and you can see that, and I'll show that to you periodically today on the maps. But on that first day, they've been staying down here in Bethany. I'll shrink that just a little bit so you can see all of it. But they stay down here in Bethany, and they travel up and around the Mount of Olives through that area of the Garden of Gethsemane, which we'll see later in the descriptions, and then ultimately on into Jerusalem, into the Temple Mount area. And you see him kind of coming and going throughout several days here, and he experiences, or they have different moments where different levels of teaching occur, different events occur during these different days, and so that's what we've been doing. And we've covered that first day, where he traveled, and then on the first day, he goes in what fashion? Triumphantly, right? Riding on a colt. How'd they get that colt? That's right. He sent his disciples into town. So you're going to go in there, and you're going to find this colt tied up, and you just take it. And when you do that, if they inquire what you're doing, just say what? The master or the Lord has use of it. And so they let them go. They bring him in, and there's a very triumphant kind of approach. They're saying Hosanna. As he enters into the city, they're laying down their garments and the leaves and all of the things that they're doing to try to give the King of Kings the proper entrance into Jerusalem. But it won't be long before these days begin to change, and the mindset of the chief priests and those in ruling power among the Jews change the disposition of the audience. And certainly we'll see that progress as you move from day to day. And so that was day one, and we've already had that discussion. Let's move now into verse 12, because here's where Jesus has already spent the first day. He goes back. Now he's traveling back to Jerusalem again. And when they were come from Bethany, remember I just showed you that. When they come from Bethany, he was what? He was hungry. So we don't have any indication as to how long it's been since he's eaten or any of those things. We just know the text says here that he's hungry. And what's he see off in the distance? A fig tree afar off having what? Having leaves. Now, again, I have neither a green thumb nor do I know a whole lot about any kind of fruit-bearing trees. I'm simply sharing with you what I can read in a book, or you could read in a book. But it's interesting with the fig tree, its fruit comes first and then the leaves. And so the assumption is if the tree has leaves, it probably has some fruit on it. Okay? Throughout the New Testament, there are references at times to the first fruits, right? They understood that concept because even though if you had a full orchard of some kind of fruit, though at the initial first fruits, you may not go in and harvest it because there's still what? A lot more fruit to come. But there is a moment where the first ripe fruit, or the first fruit that would be beneficial to you, begins to show on the trees. I believe that's the description that's happening here. You're in, if we understand when Passover, and we know this is Passover, right? We know that's the time period we're dealing with as Jesus comes into Jerusalem. And historically, you can kind of date that to the Passover of that particular year was in early, what we would call early April. And so it would be not unusual, I should say, for there to be some of the first fruit on some of the trees. The expectation of what Jesus says here as He goes towards this tree, I think, is fair. That's the point I'm trying to make. Jesus doesn't go to a tree that shouldn't have any fruit on it at all and then get mad at it, if you will. That's not the imagery here. Jesus sees the leaves and assumes that we might find some of the first fruits, even though it's not the season. Notice He says, He sees a fig tree afar off having leaves. He came if haply He might find anything thereon, might find some of those early first fruits on it. He's hungry, right? Verse 12. And when He came to it, He found nothing but leaves, for the time of figs was not. In other words, the time for full harvest was not yet. You're earlier than that. But by seeing the leaves, knowing that you can have first fruits even in that time period, and Jesus was hopeful that kind of that idea, if happily He might find anything thereon, but He doesn't. And I'm sure that's kind of disappointing. I remember my brother-in-law years ago telling me about he had on his property, he had some blackberries growing, and he would watch them. He would watch them daily almost, and he'd go and look, and they're not quite ready. He'd tell my sister, not quite ready, not quite ready, not quite ready. And he saw them one day. He says, I'm going back in whatever it was, a couple of days. They should be ready. He gets his buckets and everything. He goes down, and by the time he got there, they had been picked clean. Somebody had gone a day ahead and had picked it. And it was pretty disappointing to have gone to that patch day on your own property, mind you, and gone day in and day out and waiting for just the right moment to harvest all of those berries, and to go and see a berry patch that was just picked clean, not a berry. So you understand the idea of how disappointing this would be for Jesus, who's hungry, to see a tree in a distance, thinking in his mind that potentially should have some fruit on it, but gets there and it doesn't. Now, we can have a long discussion about whether Jesus should have known whether it had fruit on it or not. He's got the King of Kings. I get all that. But really, at the end of the day, who's this going to benefit? What happens in relationship to this fig tree? His disciples, right? The lesson he's going to teach from this eventually, he doesn't teach it immediately, but the lesson that he's ultimately going to teach in regards to the fig tree, which comes several verses later, is more about disciples than Jesus in that sense. Yeah. Let me get there, because it's weird how they, not weird, that's a strong word, but it's odd the way Mark does this, because he tells us the story, he goes away from the story, then he comes back to the story. So let me wait till I come back to the story, and then we'll talk about that. But I think you're right. Let's wait till it comes here in the narrative, just so we take it as the verses go. But Jesus then, when he sees that, he answers and said unto it, No man eat fruit of thee hereafter forever. And his disciples heard him say it. So that's all we have of this story right now, according to Mark's record, is the event itself. So keep it in the back of your mind, because it's coming back in a minute. But let's keep moving through the text, and then we'll come back when Mark comes back. So they keep traveling on in to Jerusalem. And we're on Monday at this point. Okay? So they've passed by this fig tree, and they've traveled on into the temple area. And once they arrive there in Jerusalem, they go to the temple. And what's he begin to do? In verse 15. He begins to cast out them that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of the money changers and the seats of them that sold doves. Now, keep in mind, you've got, and let me show you this map again, because it's a kind of a very basic drawing, but it'll kind of help you appreciate. And this is the temple area here, okay, where you can see the little hand circling there. That's the temple area here. Now, the temple, by the way, remember, which temple are we on by this point? Yeah, we're in essence temple 3, right? You had the original one that was just outlandish, right? Built by whom? Solomon. Just a tremendous structure, and it's gold and all of the ornate aspects of it. Just really was a spectacle to behold. Then you have the captivity. They go off into Babylonian captivity for 70 years. And after the 70 years of captivity, finally a king comes along that lets them go back. Men like Ezra and Nehemiah, right? Those guys start bringing the people back to Jerusalem. And what's one of the things they notice that's in ruins? The temple. And so they rebuild it, right? Takes them a while. They get a little trouble over it, and so it was about a 20-year span from start to finish to get it done. But they eventually get it done. And what was the mindset of the older people when they saw it? They cried, right? The older people were crying because they remember the first one, and the rebuild was not nearly what the original was. The young people were what? They're rejoicing and excited because they don't really have much of a memory. It's 70 years, right? So these folks that are older that were able to imagine that, and depending on what point you went off into the captivity, you're up in years. But you remember it, but the younger people don't really remember, and they're excited just to get back on track and get a place to worship God. But then even by the time after the 400 years we often call of silence between Malachi and when Jesus arrives on the scene, or John the Baptist in some sense, but that time period, and we begin the process, you got a 400-year span, and by this point, Herod has kind of, the king over Judea, has kind of taken over the temple, and he's kind of designed and created it and fashioned it in a way that kind of suits his purposes. When people come to his town that he's in charge of, then he could show it as a spectacle. But even though the Jews are theoretically, religiously still in charge of what's happening at the temple, the Romans had pretty much taken charge of the city. They're in charge governmentally. And this temple here is more we consider Herod's in the sense of who designed and purposed it. And so you've got Herod, but here the chief priests and everyone, and only certain people were allowed into certain areas of the temple itself, right? In fact, who was allowed in the holiest of holies? The high priest only, right? Once a year, offer sacrifice on behalf of himself and the people. Then there's the holy place, and who can go in there? The priest, which Jesus was not, right? Jesus was not a priest. Jesus was from the tribe of Judah. He was not of the tribe of Levi. He will become a high priest under the order of Melchizedek, but not under the order of Aaron. Here's the point I'm trying to make. Don't when you hear the word temple, think of all of it. Okay? Don't think of oxen and money changers sitting inside the holiest of holies. They're out in these courtyards. Okay? It's all considered the temple. The entire area is considered the temple. They hadn't gotten so bad that they've got a money changer sitting inside the holiest of holies. They're not far from that, but they have some restrictions still about it. Even to the point where Jesus, as a non-Levite, would not have been permitted in certain areas inside the temple itself by law. And Jesus adhered to the law perfectly. That's the way it can be described of Him, that there was no sin, no guile, no iniquity in the life of Jesus. So anyway, just keep that picture in mind. We're dealing with these courtyards. And so when Jesus enters into these courtyard areas or near Solomon's porch, you'll see the apostles there when they begin to preach and teach the gospel. And so when He gets into that region, He finds these money changers. He finds these folks who are selling all kinds of things in relationship to those who might be coming to the temple, who might need a pigeon or some other offering of sacrifice that they can make. And so He begins to cast them out that sold and bought in the temple, and overthrew the tables of money changers and the seats of them that sold doves. What's interesting is there's some historical evidence to show that this was basically a marketplace that the high priest was profiting off of. There's some record that shows Annas, who was the high priest at the time, or one of them. The Romans had one and the Jews had one. But Caiaphas is kind of co-working with him, although they're family. And so this marketplace historically is known as an area where the high priest in particular and the other priests were profiting from this. They through their leadership, in a sense, had turned the courtyards in and around the temple as a place of merchandise. Now this, by the way, is not the first time Jesus has done that, right? Yeah, it's great. I believe in His first year of preaching and teaching. Remember, he goes about 30 years just kind of growing up and maturing before the bulk of His work happens in a 3-year span. And so at the very beginning of that, He comes to Jerusalem, finds these folks there, and grabs a whip and drives them out, right? But that lasted how long? Well, for however long they were scared of Him in the moment, but He no longer left that they did what? Everything came right back. And so here He returns a couple of years later. He returns to the same scene, and He finds it just the way it was the first time. You can only imagine how in some senses, how much that would elevate the frustration of Jesus to think that I've addressed this once, and here we are again a couple of years later, and they didn't think or learn anything from that moment. And so they've turned the temple into a marketplace. And the money changers, by the way, weren't necessarily, according again to history, weren't necessarily the most honest of men. I've only exchanged money one time. I had one trip into Canada when I was working with Dennis Allen up in Michigan, and he and I went into Canada, and we exchanged. It wasn't much. It wasn't like hundreds and hundreds of dollars. It was like $20 of American money into whatever it equated to in Canada. And I could remember I was all excited because I think it was something like my $20 bill turned into 22 Canadian dollars. Then we went to eat dinner that night, and the prices were 3 times as much as it was on the American side of the border, and realized this isn't working out to my advantage. So I didn't go grab a bunch of 20s and try to make an exchange to my benefit. But they were doing that, and they weren't necessarily using the proper scales. They weren't necessarily being the most honest of individuals, as people would come and they would try to exchange whatever currency they had from where they were, or it may just be weights. It may be maybe you had some silver, or you had something else that was of value, and you had to put it in a scale and determine its value. These men were known for not for their most honest approaches to that. Yep. No, I from what I'm reading, and again, I'm just basing it on from what I'm reading. These were controlled and ran by the priests at the temple. You've got this at the courtyard of the temple, and from everything I can read, and again, I'm just trusting the history that I'm reading. I no way for me to know from this text or from anything else, but that the high priest and the priests were involved in these things that were in the inner courts and the outer courts go a little beyond that, and then you're into the Gentile marketplaces. in and around. That's just my understanding, Bob. That doesn't mean I'm right. It just means that's what I've read. Yeah. That's the best answer I can provide for you based on what I'm reading. That there was there could have been, I suppose, Gentiles involved in this. It wouldn't have been shocking for them to have allowed that, though probably not in some senses. But because those were the kinds of laws that they were pretty strict about. You know what I mean? They, yeah, yeah. I, I can just give you what I believe or what I've read. Yep, go ahead, Ed. Yeah, 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 exactly. And you would have no ability to know. You know what does this equate to in the currency that I need at this location? Yeah, yeah. What was it? Now my brain went blank for a minute. But was it not a shekel? Was it a shekel? I'm trying to remember. Was it a shekel that every man had to pay, no matter what is? It didn't matter how rich or how poor. Anyway, I'd have to go back and read some of that again. But right, right. Yeah, 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 yeah. 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 Before then, right? And what's interesting, keep in mind too, you are not dealing with just any average week. You're in the week of past. You're at the highest festival they had in Jerusalem, and more people from more regions would be flooding the city than really at any other time of the year. And so you've elevated, and then Jesus' statement as he taught them, saying, "Is it not written, my house shall be called of all nations the house of prayer?" This is a house of prayer. This is a house of worship. This is where God is honored. But you've made it into a den of thieves. You've turned it into a place where people can come and take advantage of one another and rob one another and deprive one another. It was a pretty sad commentary that he gives to them concerning it. And the scribes and chief priests heard it and sought how they might destroy him, for they feared him, because all the people was astonished at his doctrine. The people are responding to what Jesus is saying. And they're realizing, you know what, we shouldn't be in. The people are thinking to themselves, you know, he's right. This is supposed to be a house of prayer. This isn't a place for money changers and the selling of goods. This is a place for prayer and worship. The people are starting to go, you know, he's right. And the scribes and the chief priests begin to see how the people are beginning to react to the teachings of Jesus, and they're now afraid of it. It's kind of the moment, if you will. They've always kind of sought to see whether they could trap him, accuse him of something, find a way to charge him with something that could put him to death. But they've kind of reached kind of that pinnacle now as we're leading up to the crucifixion just in a few days, they've kind of reached that pinnacle where we have to do something about him. He's influencing people to such a degree that we're going to lose our influence over them. You can kind of see their mindset gets very locked in to what must be done in their minds in order to challenge this. And I believe that, well, yes and no. There were proselytes who had become part of that weren't part of the born Jews. It was in some senses a beacon of worship for God to all nations, and there were Jews in all nations. They had spread out to a point where you have Jews in regions and parts of all the known world at that time. They would travel. You go into Acts chapter 2, and you see all those folks, and you just see the place after place after place that's listed. The gospel was preached to the Jew first, but think about why they needed all those languages to be able to preach to them in Acts chapter. Well, it's because they came from all over the place. Alluding to this time period. There in Isaiah 56, alluding to the time period in which Jesus would come and usher in a moment where all people could come and worship God. Yeah. So that scene has ended. Now they leave and they come back again in the morning. And as they passed by, they saw what? Now we can go back to that conversation. Now they see the fig tree. And the fig tree is all dried up from the what? From the roots. Have you ever walked outside and saw a tree that had leaves on it and seemed perfectly healthy and alive and well? Go to bed that night and come back the next morning and it's all dried up from the roots up. Ever seen that? Without some kind of... No, right? You generally don't see that. Anyway, I know of a fellow one time that thought he was spraying his orchard with some insect repellent, and he actually was spraying grass and weed kill on it. But that's another story for another time. He pretty much destroyed his orchard. But anyway, but generally it doesn't happen overnight. They're astonished. Okay, keep that in mind. One day they pass by the fig tree. Jesus curses that you will never grow any fruit on you. No man will ever have fruit from you. They go on into the city. They go through all that. They go back to Bethany. They come back the next day. And lo and behold, that tree's got nothing. It's withering away from the roots up. Peter calls it to remembrance and says to him, verse 21, Master, behold, the fig tree which thou cursest is withered away. Read it that way, because that's kind of the way he's saying it. He's in amazement. All you had to do was say, cursed be you. And that tree's withering up. I think Bob's right. Go back to that conversation now, Bob. In the idea that Israel, the Jews, are the fig tree. And for a long period of time, they have had the appearance, they've had the leaves. They've had the appearance of being the people of God, but no fruit. Maud Davis's mother, Ruth Church, she asked me to preach a sermon one time about all leaves and no fruit. And I did somewhere in my files, I have that sermon that she requested for me to preach, because that's the way we become sometimes. The Jews have become that. We can become that, where we have the appearance of all kinds of things, but we're not producing fruit. And this fig tree becomes a figure of that. And it's important to remember that you're in that transitional time period where it's not going to be long before the New Testament's going to be ushered in. The old law is going to be nailed to the cross. And that Jewish system is going to be fulfilled in Jesus and will have served its purpose and be put aside for the new covenant in the blood of the Lamb. And this figure of this fig tree kind of becomes an illustration of that. But interesting, what's he say to them when they acknowledge that? Okay, so he said, Jesus answered to say it unto him, have faith in God. For verily I say unto you that whosoever shall say unto this mountain. Now, let me pull this. So we're on that Tuesday, okay? We've made our trek. Sunday, back that night. Monday, back that night. Tuesday, and just imagine, of course, we don't know where that tree was. It's just represented on the map, right? We know the area, but we don't know exactly where it was. But but it's on this path that they've been using to get up into Jerusalem. First day it had leaves, this day it doesn't. And he says, with faith in God, you can say to, what's the word? This mount. Now you've got two options maybe I think that would work in that moment. You're right beside the Mount of Olives. Okay, the Mount of the Press. And we talked a little bit about that already. So I suppose it'd be very, very easily Jesus could have been pointing to that mountain, the Mount of Olives, and said, "You by faith you could say to this mountain, be gone," and it could be removed or relocated. But what else is on a mountain? Jerusalem's on a mountain. Okay, we call this area up here the Temple Mount. Okay, it's up. That's why almost every time in Scripture you hear anybody going to Jerusalem, how do they get there? They went up to Jerusalem. It didn't matter whether they were east, west, north, or south. You always go up to Jerusalem because you can't get there without climbing up onto the top where it is. And so maybe, back to the figure, Jesus is saying this mountain. You may think that they have power and control. You may think they have the upper hand. You may think that Jewish system is winning the day. But he says in the figure, they're like that tree that had the leaves, but they're withering up. And yes, this mountain that seems so, how could you change, right? How could we have any lasting or real effect on this tremendous mountain of worship and religion? And Jesus says, by faith. By faith we can make this happen. By faith we can change the mindset and encourage folks to come to God through the Son. But His apostles were going to have a lot of faith and confidence in Him to make it happen. You're going to have the faith to move mountains. And you're going to have a heart that doesn't doubt. Believe that those things which He saith shall come to pass. He shall have whatsoever He saith. You need to trust in God and have confidence when you're fulfilling His will that the things that you're asking for and the things that you're moving for and the things that you're working towards can have success. Therefore I say unto you, what things soever ye desire, when ye pray, believe that you receive them, and ye shall have them. They're going to go through a ton of doubts in just a few days. Peter's going to go from one moment where he says, I'll die with you before I ever say one word against you, to warming himself by the fire and 3 times saying, I know not the man, I know not the man, I know not the man, right? It's going to feel like maybe they can never build the kind of faith that's necessary. And Peter kind of becomes the highlight of that because there's some very specific things that happen in relationship to Peter. But the truth of the matter is all of his immediate disciples scatter when Jesus is taken prisoner in the garden. And He reminds them before that ever happens, pray. But pray believing that you'll receive When you stand praying, forgive if you have aught against any, that your Father also which is in heaven may forgive you your trespasses. What's that sound similar to? Yeah, what we often call the Lord's Prayer. That model prayer that Jesus gave is being reiterated in certain fashions here among His apostles. Parts of it. But if you do not forgive, neither will your Father which is in heaven forgive your trespasses. The message of Jesus has always been about forgiveness. I want you to think of the very first time the gospel message is being preached. What's the core of that message to the audience there in Acts chapter 2? What you think about that? Even though you killed the Son of God, you can still be forgiven. It's the message of Acts chapter 2. What you think about that? Even though the guilt of the blood of Jesus Christ is on your hands, even though you went as far as to put to death the Son of God, forgiveness is offered unto you. You still have access to forgiveness. The message of Jesus has been forgiveness from the very beginning. From the very first time that message begins to be preached, and He encourages them to appreciate the core part of that. If you don't forgive, neither will your Father forgive. It's important for them as they pray and they communicate with their Father in heaven that they remember the importance of forgiveness in relationship to that. Are there going to be a lot of hurtful things done to them? Yeah. There are going to be a lot of things that they need there are going to be things they need to be forgiven for, and there are going to be things that they need to offer forgiveness because of. It's an interesting perspective and an interesting timing in some ways that Jesus communicates and reminds them of this message. And with the proper faith and with the proper confidence in God, He says these things are possible. These things are absolutely possible. Go ahead, Bob. Yeah. Well, and I think, Bob, maybe the mistake we make is that we take a text like this and we think in our minds, well, that means I can do anything. If I do it by faith, then I can do anything. That's not exactly the point. Yeah. I think that the point is that when faith is there, if it necessitates removing a mountain and moving it to the sea, if faith is there, it can be accomplished. But it has to be gauged or guided by what the will of God is and what the purposes of God is. And so He's simply using an extreme to try to illustrate the point, which we do sometimes too. We'll use extremes to try to make sure that people get the point that if you have faith and there's a work and a cause of Christ that needs to be fulfilled, and it takes moving that mountain, then that's what will happen. And keep in mind His audience. These are His apostles that He's with, and they're going to have different kinds of responsibilities and challenges they have to fulfill as well. So.